Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Steve Mondernach. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Food and Drug Officials, and we appreciate you all taking time out of your schedules to join us this afternoon to learn more about the brand new, just off the printer model hemp code that we've just completed. We've got three wonderful presenters that will be talking a little bit more about that as we go into the discussion. But I wanted to go ahead and just introduce AFTO to all of you, as some of you may not be familiar with AFTO. The Association of Food and Drug Officials dates back to 1896 and was founded by state regulatory programs in the food and dairy area, recognizing the need to work together for the safety of food products, and also recognizing the need for uniformity in laws across state lines. As commerce started becoming less local and more regional and more national, that need became a greater need. The Association of Food and Drug Officials does have 6 regional affiliates across the country. For those of you that aren't familiar with those, you can learn more about them on our website, which is afto.org. In addition, the association also works very hard to really accomplish 4 things: connect, share, impact, and protect. For more than a century, AFTO has connected food and medical products professionals in the public and private sectors, providing a forum for sharing various goals and disciplines and perspectives with the goal of impacting the regulatory environment to protect the health and welfare of the global community. For more than a century, AFTO has served in this role, and actually predating the actual regulatory authority at the federal level as it relates to food and medical products. I'm just going to begin a little bit and introduce the topic here. As many of you may or may not be aware, this is kind of cannabis and hemp have kind of followed the standard regulatory landscape of what tends to happen in a new program area. So what tends to happen is it can go one of 2 routes. If it's a federal creature and the federal government legalizes it first, there's a top-down approach. If the states legalize and first, there's essentially a bottom-up approach. So cannabis and hemp are very much a bottom-up approach in that each state has done a little bit different regulatory program for hemp and cannabis, and that's what we've seen. No differently than what we saw with the food and dairy laws across the country. We go back to 1896. And really, there was very little uniformity across the states, and that gradually improved when 1906, when we get the first, the Pure Food Act and the Meat and Poultry Inspection Act passed. And then going forward, as we move forward even further, we start seeing more uniformity as it relates in the retail food area, restaurants, grocery stores, et cetera, really culminating with the model, the model food code, which comes out in the late 80s, early 90s officially. There were some revisions and drafts out there before that. But really, same sort of process that has been happening in hemp and cannabis. As people get more experience, some more standard things happen, and we get better at saying and figuring out what those should be. Well, I just wanted to do that little bit of introduction to the concept today, but I want to go ahead and take a minute or two to introduce our speakers, and also the folks that has spent a great deal of time working on pulling this model code together. First speaker is Leslie Engleking, who is founder and president of the Foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards, or FOCUS. FOCUS is an international nonprofit cannabis standards development and third-party certification organization created to protect public health, consumer safety, and safeguard the environment. Leslie possesses more than 2 decades of professional experience across pharmaceutical, mental health, nonprofit, and cannabis industries. More than 12 years at Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals laid a perfect foundation for Leslie's role as executive director of the first chain of vertically integrated medical cannabis operations in Phoenix. Leslie's proven success in a highly regulated pharmaceutical industry, combined with her firsthand experience working in the unregulated cannabis industry, place her in an ideal position to lead the company creating the first international quality and safety-based voluntary consensus cannabis standards and third-party certification platform. As always, we're very excited to have Leslie join us today. Our second speaker is Kyle Baker. Kyle is the founder and CEO of EcoBuds. He founded the company based upon a deep understanding and experience in socio-technical design and ecometric modeling, and their application to disease mitigation. He has expertise to 16 core markets for chlorine dioxide use, including the adaptation of chloride dioxide for disinfection and sterilization in brewery and winery operations, and the use under Minor Use Minor Species Act, as well as supporting wastewater treatment patents in automotive and secondary manufacturer markets. In other words, Kyle is very smart. As a cannabis entrepreneur, Kyle has his attention on scientific verification of methods and weighted decision-making to ensure the end-to-end delivery of clean and compliant cannabis consumers, most notably medical patients. And once again, our third speaker is Yvonne Salvinger, who is well known to many of the AFTO audience. Yvonne is a microbiologist and was previously the chief for the Bureau of Food Laboratories Division of Food Safety with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. She went to the Division of Food Safety initially as a quality manager to pursue ISO 17025 accreditation for the Division of Laboratories in 2002. Accreditation was accomplished in 2007. She was also involved in the Food Emergency Response Network, working on several activities involving food analysis of foods during emergency events, including developing SOPs. Prior to that work, she worked with the Bureau of Public Health Laboratories with the Florida Department of Health for 20 years, working in tuberculosis and infectious disease. Since retiring from the state of Florida in 2012, she is a consultant on FDA cooperative agreements with AFTO and also with APHL. In addition, she's been actively working with AOAC on their work on cannabis methods development. We're pleased to welcome Yvonne also. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our speakers today. Leslie, I believe you're beginning.
Yeah, so I think thanks for that, Steve, and thanks to AFTO for hosting and everybody for being with us today. We're pretty excited to be able to finally present this document to you. It's a couple years of a lot of work and a lot of input from a big group of people that with the intent of really providing a valuable document that can help guide regulators as well as industry on the post-harvest manufacturing and production of cannabis consumable products that come from hemp. So I think first place to start would be to kind of talk about why we did this. Anybody that is involved in any sense, I think, with the cannabis industry has an understanding of the confusion around this space, whether it's deciding if something is marijuana or hemp, or if it's federally legal or state legal. When the Farm Bill legalized hemp at the federal level, it left a lot of questions that have been unanswered. And so this document is an attempt to provide some guidance to states to be able to adequately protect for public health and consumer safety in their hemp programs across the US. It's an interesting thing in cannabis, and I think there's a lot of perfect examples in the media today, but there is no unified regulations. There are no unified even language around this. There are a lot of different rules from state to state and federal to state, not necessarily based on science, and they're not necessarily defined measurements, but they're different. And so the idea of this document is a starting place for a national policy to kind of at least build and grow from. Kyle, do you want to, or Yvonne, add anything to that? I know we kind of talked about some other examples.
No, I mean, the importance of this document, as well as like standards and rules and regulations, and as we are right now in this ununified position, it's really hard to make decisions for any operator or regulator going state to state. You have to be able to make decisions that are uniform, and this document allows that type of guidance to occur. Oh, you're on mute, Yvonne.
Famous last words.
Yeah, I was going to say, I had the garbage man. It's real life. Even what we based the document on was, we had a lot of discussions on those types of things. What would be the base of a document? What other guidance should be incorporated? We kind of had to go back and forth on that, and how important is it to really have what are we talking about even? And so we even have issues with definitions when we had to talk about lots and batches. I don't know how many weeks that was. Just to find a good definition in print from the legislation, there's multiples, and which one is going to fit best with this product. So we had a lot of just even planning discussions on how to get started before we could even get to the product itself, and then do the editing. So,
and I think a lot of those challenges exist in the marketplace today. I mean, I feel like what we sort of went through as a group, and it obviously was a much greater group than just the four of us on this call today, but in going through this, I think is exactly what happens at both the state and federal level when you're looking at these. And you think about terms like broad spectrum in cannabis, when we don't even have a definition for every cannabinoid. So how are we talking broad spectrum on all these products, right? And so there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things left to be defined and really solidified in this space. And I think this document is the attempt to do that, with the idea that it will, continue to be improved and updated as the industry grows and changes and updates.
Bringing up an interesting point, Yvonne, your background in regulation and building SOPs, specifically with labs. I mean, what do you think the challenges are, right now, and how this relates to this document from a laboratory perspective?
some of the things are even definitions again, going back to what is the product, when do you cut it off, the measurements of uncertainty, how is that going to get you into trouble if you go a little bit over in the THC content? How accurate are your tests? We have a lot of discussion. There's a lot of method development occurring right now, and a lot of kits going through validations and that sort of thing, which is very important. But even what do you validate again? Because your reference method, there is no federal reference method, which is what we normally do in a regulatory environment. There is no, so we're having to do kind of what's the best thing to do, because in the future, maybe it is going to be regulated. So would we want to kind of slant towards that with the product? What's the products? You have, so many things. It could be gummy bears. It can be, you're starting from scratch on the methods, where with foods, you've already had, you've got matrix extensions because you have a lot of methods out there. You just add another food product here. You're starting from base. And so it's kind of the Wild West, so to speak. But I think we're getting there. It's just a matter of building a program. And, that's always, as Steve said, from the ground up versus having some direction from above. So it's a little bit tough going, but it's doable. And the good thing is you have an opportunity here to really do it right and learn from the lessons you've had in the past. So.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out too that the model code document is intended to cover everything that needs to be addressed in a state regulation. And it's usable without creating a conflict of interest with any of the federal regulations, right? We've based this upon food code and other documents like that. So the idea that there's so much confusion between a state and federal regulation, this document is intended to sort of cut some of that out on the regulatory level and simplify things. Do you want to talk a little bit about the other things besides food code that we base this on, Kyle or Steve or anybody really?
Well, Steve and I, when we were talking the other day, we were talking about a historical perspective of where we are in this cannabis space versus where we've been historically. Steve, you were talking the other day about kind of the model food code in the dairy industry, and it took about 10 years for that model to take and be adapted to the federal level. Is that accurate? Steve still with us?
I don't know.
Not, just barely. So it actually took even longer than that. We actually started, there were some early model codes back in the 50s, and then, the 1976 sanitation manual on the retail level became the standard for a lot of times, along with 3 other codes that went along with it. And then eventually they got merged into finally the food code, covering both salvage operations, retail food service, retail and food service both, forming the retail food code as we get into the 80s and 90s. But even at that point, it took years for states to actually go to the step of adopting that, and there were a lot of variations initially. And today we see far fewer variations in the adoption, and we see a more rapid adoption process of the food code. In some cases, it's actually automatically adopted when it's released in state law or local jurisdictional ordinance. So that's definitely been an evolution over time. The other thing that we see is as a regulatory area becomes more mature, we see fewer changes. So if you were going to go take a look in the last 10 years of the changes in the food code, there aren't a lot of significant changes. If you were going to look in the previous 10 years, there were more. And if you look at the first 10 years, there were a lot. So over time, the regulatory areas become more stable and we see fewer changes. So I think that's another thing that we will see in this space, that gradually we'll get to that point of stability. It might take a little while to get there, but you just like everything, you kind of hit those eras as you move forward. So, and I apologize. Sorry, I was on mute and couldn't find it.
No, it's okay. I'm going to keep you on the hook for another minute if you don't mind, because I'd like to, we talked a lot when we were developing this about how it can be used and what is the benefit to the regulators. And I think, Steve, just given your background and experience, you'd probably be the right person to kind of at least start this. But, there's different ways to do this, right? It can be used as a reference document only. It can be adopted in sections, or it can be adopted in its entirety as the regulatory structure. And I think if you don't mind kind of talking about what the benefits and differences are to each of those, at least at a brief level, so we can kind of get a discussion going around there, that would be great.
Sure. Well, it's no different than other sorts of regulations at the state level. You can think about this as whether this is the beginning of a regulation that you might adopt pieces from and use to develop your own regulation is one option. It might be that you say, hey, this really works for us. We're just going to adopt this whole and take the and essentially insert our name into the spots. That's a possibility. Or it might be you look at what pieces you need for your program. You might need this piece and this piece and this piece, but you might not need everything. Depending on your program, that's very possible, and you might want to go down that path. This is really an opportunity to give you some beginning ideas, looking across the country at some of what was the best work done, looking at the model, essentially some of the other model documents that were produced. And like I said, this is step one and generation one. As we mature, I suspect we will see evolution, but this is the beginning point to this work.
For sure. I mean, I feel like as a team, we've experienced evolution of this document every month, right? As we've been developing it. But even since we've been putting the final pieces on this, it seems like there's been updates that have to be made, every other couple of weeks. We recognize something else. So the fact that it is a living, breathing document with the intent to be continually updated is important. I don't know if we talked about this before, but I think it's also important to mention that we did send this out to states and get feedback a few different times. Yvonne, you want to talk a little bit about that process and some of the comments that we got back from it?
Yeah, we did send it out through AFDO. So, and tried to be pretty broad about who we were sending it to. And also we did address every single comment within our group, as far as there were very helpful ones, not just editorial, but even just some rearrangement of text and that sort of thing. And so I think, we're, at least for a base document, it's something that going forward, I think if it does get used, I mean, with the food code, there's CFP, the Food Protection Conference, they have a periodic base where they go through and update. And so that, whether this is something that develops into something like that for the industry, that's another whole question. But I think it was very valuable to get. We also got some industry input as well, because that's the other key component there, is not just the regulation, the regulators, but you have to be, is this going to be something that's doable? What do we have to do to make sure we can enforce it? So.
This document, we often talk about what's this mean for the industry, but there's a lot of significance of what this means to this industry being able to participate in the broader economy. And that has a lot of relationship to risk as it relates to like insurance providers and informing underwriting provisions. And even us as an independent company use these types of codes to give us the ability to make informed decisions that fit within, the standard and the model code. So there's a lot of significance, and
Oh, it looks like I'm locked.
Are you on, Leslie?
now we can hear. Looks like we have
I can't
we have a
see
couple
anything,
questions
but I
coming in as well.
Yeah.
But
Amy, do you want to do some of the questions since we've got some pretty?
Sure, let's do some questions. So this came in the question box. The food code applies to the retail operations, not manufacturing. The manufacturing of CBD concentrate from hemp and subsequent use in other value added products, food, candy, etc., would lend itself more to the regulations coded in 21 CFRs like 117s and 111s. So why was the food code used as a model rather than manufacturing regulations? Someone want to take that one?
Well, one of the things is we did actually in our references that we did use parts of the 21 CFR. So it's not, that was kind of the base, but we did use things from the 2017 Model Food Code, the 21 CFR, and also 9 CFR. We also used some focus standards, which Leslie's group there has actually some other standards. Also some guidance for industry on the food labeling guides and some local state, some other regulations that we thought might be useful. So it's kind of a blend, if that helps make it digestible.
It's the document itself, the focus standards are based on the CFRs 110, 111, 117, even 210 and 211. So we have some of that from the manufacturing perspective and the laboratory perspective that's been pulled into the document. But in my mind, this is more of a regulatory document. It's not a guidance for industry, right? This is what regulatory officials should be considering. And so we weren't trying to write GMPs per se. We were trying to write a model code. And I just think there's a difference there. Steve, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that's fair, not to mention that, as we know, hemp covers all the spaces, not just manufactured foods, but also gets into the retail, or not just manufacturing, but gets into the retail area and the retail space and all sizes of operations from the smallest to the biggest. And even in manufactured foods or in manufacturing settings, sometimes while the GMPs apply, the smaller operators look more to the food code type situation just because they can relate better to it, and it's more clear. It's sometimes the GMPs are just very, as you know, allow lots of variation, and if you don't have a scientific staff in place, sometimes looking to the more specifics of the food code can be helpful. So those are a couple of the reasons why we looked at a variety of things as we're bringing them together. I'm going to take the next question just so you all know, and that was, what is the chance state and federal regulators will adopt and use this? Well, I think, that's a great question. Let me just give you some other examples. AFTO prepared a cottage food guide a number of years ago, and elements of that guide are in use in many states across the country as they've legalized cottage foods. Now, it may not be every piece of it, although there are a few states that literally have adopted it verbatim, but others have adopted pieces of it or used it as their guidance as they're preparing, developing their cottage food laws. So, I think it will likely see over time a variety of approaches to how that gets applied. I'm not sure that we have a crystal ball to tell you what to expect beyond that, but I definitely is a beginning point.
Well, and I think part of the document and the importance of it, of just having it as a starting point, right? And so regardless, we can't we cannot predict exactly how this will be adopted or at what level or by whom, but we know that we at least have a starting point that everybody's working from. And so as people and states make adoptions and decide what's important, we're able to go back and update this and really understand, you know, from a holistic perspective across the country what's important. And I think that's one of the benefits of, at least in my opinion, from a focus perspective of why we like our partnership with AFTO and working with AFTO so much, is because that they have the regulatory structure and relationships to make sure that we can continue the work, that we are taking into consideration the needs of all the people in the states across the country and not just one certain area or even one certain industry.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to mention these were voluntary consensus driven guides, you know, and there's still ample opportunity to join in with AFTO and join committees to include your, you know, our audiences and other regulators and people in the industry's thoughts on these matters to continue to make that grow.
AFTA does have a cannabis committee as well, so that's, you know, a great forum to get started with some of that.
Yep.
So,
And there's, you know, you look at what's going on in the industry, especially on the hemp side of the industry with the Delta 8 issues today, right? And the Farm Bill passed in 2018. USDA final rule is finally in place as of last month. And it seems to me like we've got more confusion today than we ever have had. So the idea is certainly not, in our opinion, that this is going to change the world and solve every problem related to cannabis or hemp or marijuana. The idea is we do have a very solid regulatory document as guidance, as a beginning, that does not conflict with any federal laws, that can work within the state structures to get going. And I think that is really what you have to see as the important part of this, is not, I know from an industry perspective, every operator is going, is this going to be what I have to follow? Is these the regs that I have to meet or not? Right. And we're not here to say that that's what this is at all. That's not even the intent of a model code. I mean, we're writing this as guidance on the regulatory side. Do we think this will probably end up looking like that? Sure. We wouldn't have written it another way. That would be silly. But we're not here to say that this is the regulations. Or anything like that. So I don't know what our audience looks like demographic wise this time, but for the industry side, I think that's an important sort of point to mention.
well, there's a lot of benefits to the industry, you know, by
For sure.
uptaking a document like this. You know, I think we discussed increasing safety, you know, both from an employee liability perspective and a product consumer liability perspective, and ultimately reduces the complexity. So, you know, having definitions and appendices to be able to refer to allows us to make, again, we get to better decision-making capabilities. There was a pocket guide. Amy, are you able to put that up? The pocket guide?
Which one?
The AFTO Pocket Guide Handbook Food Code for 2013, third edition. And who would?
If you want to keep chatting about something else, I will.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's we were talking about who would use that particular guide through AFTO, or who uses it currently from a regulatory perspective. Yvonne, you might be able to answer that, or maybe Steve.
Maybe Steve, yeah.
Kyle, is it the Food Code Pocket Guide for Regulators?
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
So actually, it's just a good abbreviation for those of you that are in GMPs. There's also a pocket guide that's produced by a publication company out there that a lot of folks use. It just is a good starting point when you're quickly trying to find the reference versus digging through your 500 pages of food codes. So that's kind of the primary use of that. It's a much faster, quicker, down and dirty sort of approach, as the saying goes, to learning more. But yes. Or maybe the food code for dummies, as the case may be. That might be another way to think of it.
And this is available at the AFTA website.
It is.
And I did share the link in the chat box.
Yeah. I'm looking.
Or I will, sorry.
Yeah, and that's one thing too, is these documents are available at the AFTA website. So, you know, they're please take advantage of being able to access them and use them.
We were talking about some of the challenges, which I think is kind of interesting. We've had a global pandemic that's occurred. We've done a lot of this. When we started this, we were able to meet in person. And
What
where
about
were
that?
we at? Atlanta.
That's
Yep.
true.
Lots have changed since then. We've all been meeting virtually, and so where did this start? We started doing this. We all met together for the first time. What was it? June of 2019.
Yeah,
I believe. And there was a lot of work done even prior to that. There was, Yvonne, you were mentioning like the difference between lot and batch and how many times we had to go over that in terms of the challenges. Do you guys have anything that sticks out in your mind just in the creation of this document that was particularly interesting?
I think the definitions was something, I mean, that was probably one of our bigger discussion points, and with the comments too, is where did this come from, and making sure it was reflective of the industry. There was industry specific things that I'm not so familiar with, but I learned from you guys.
Right.
And that's another whole thing. It's just the language and what's best to use for this scenario type thing. We have a lot of different topics: receiving, storage, equipment, refuse disposal. What do we need to be worried about for that industry? It's not just food, and that's the other component of it. It's the hemp, and if it's not, then you even have more issues. So, kind of marrying those two elements together was important, I think, and also just took a lot of thought. You don't want to overstep, but you want to make sure you're including things that are going to be a problem.
Well, and I think that, the food side, the adding hemp to food is where we see so many challenges with quality and safety, right? There's the manufacturing guidelines for the operators on how they're doing extracts or distillates or whatever they're doing. But at the same, like the food safety part is something that doesn't seem to be well understood yet in cannabis. And it's definitely the way cannabis is being delivered is mostly through these orally consumed products, right? And so we needed to assure that there were food safety type guidelines around that as well, just to control for any of the, quality and safety issues that can really cause people harm. Not that, it's the hemp that's dangerous, right? We're not worried. That's not what we're saying, but all the risks of contamination and cross-contamination that come up with any food production situation are obviously there in hemp and not typically well addressed.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit, Leslie, about the manufacturing, some of the things we added there? They were from the focus standards.
Yeah, basically we just added some guidelines on the extraction section from the focus standards, which the standards should be up on the AFDO website and available for download as well. But because, and this kind of goes back to the why did we use food code and that, for the end products, food code made sense, but we did want to add in some manufacturing requirements and guidance on what, how to do that safely. And so section 11, which is manufacturing, is from the focus standards and adopted into this as the guidance on how to do that. Again, I think that there's a lot more that can be added, but at least this addresses, solvent-based extraction, water-based, CO2-based, some of the emergency procedures and things that need to go along with it, just to ensure not only safe products, but safe operations, facilities, and employees.
Yeah, and that's not something you're going to find in the food codes.
No. Yeah,
Some
so
of
when we
my-
say it's food code, it's not just food code.
Yeah.
Some of my favorite parts of this code was the discussion of infrastructure, like having a 45-degree cove base in high water activity areas. Those are things that we see in the industry. They're just overlooked because people don't know. So, being able to understand why that is and have some clear direction, I thought was particularly fascinating, and it just solves a ton of problems that can occur down the road.
Well, my favorite is the laboratory section testing, which is section 18. And we wanted to talk about homogeneity and safety. Again, we have the quality issues, but also the safety issues with any of these type things with the throughout the document. And also to make sure we have good, valid methods, that the processes have been validated, and for example, new packaging, that it's not just thrown out there and says, okay, it's good to go. There's studies that have to be done. Hemp as an ingredient, that it's tested according to any regulatory authority requirements that are out there, whatever they are. And we have microbial, chemical contaminants, including pesticides is a big one. And, we had a question here, I think, about are there methods that can be added to a lab scope of accreditation? With AOAC, there are validated methods coming up and being produced, and that's something to be on the lookout for. That's a very valid place to find good methods, is through the AOAC International, and that's their name now. So you can look up the cannabis information on AOAC, and I can get that website for you as well. With CASP, they have a special group working on things there.
They're working with NIST as well, the National Institute of,
Yeah.
Standards and Time?
Technology, I think.
Yeah, technology. Yeah. You're talking about biological contamination, lab results of microbial populations. We see, or at least we've observed in the hemp industry in some different states, where you'll just have tested as a general mark on a COA, for example. So it doesn't tell us anything other than it's been tested, which is very different from, like, say, our state regulated cannabis sectors who go through pretty stringent microbial testing. So, this document will help provide some oversight or some direction for those, state hemp companies that are wanting to, understand microbial testing and acceptable limits.
Yeah, and we didn't go into real specifics in the main text about what methods to use, because that is state dependent and there's laws out there already. But we did add an Appendix A, and that's based on the focus testing requirements to give you some tangible things to look for. And, that includes testing plans, sampling plans, and processes, because the sampling is probably one of the more important things that has to be done correctly. Without that, you've got not good results. Some of the things to be looking at if you're wanting to do some testing, the metals, pesticides, potency, that's always our favorite there, contaminants and filth, stability testing, and some of these are quality as well. You don't want something that's going to be on the market and then get rotten in a few weeks. So, or mold contamination. So that's necessarily going to hurt you, but it's not going to be nice to eat. So that's another whole component of things,
That's an interesting one.
Testing. Yeah.
Yeah. Moisture content versus water activity, and understanding those two different measures. There was a lot of, I think, misunderstanding that, there was water activity and people were completely unaware of it. And that has everything to do with shelf life stability.
Right.
And for organisms to be able, spoilage organisms to be able to live. That's one of the factors that are addressed in there.
Yeah.
So, but I'm surprised we haven't had any D8 questions today.
I want to just say too, as far as, because we're getting a lot of questions on the lab requirements and testing requirements based on focus standards. I think it's important to understand the perspective of why this was added and included, because it wasn't necessarily our intent to include it first, but when we sent this document out to a large group of regulatory officials and got comments back, what we heard is we really, really need help with what testing limits should be. What is an acceptable limit of these things? And so since we had the focus standards to use that, we included them within the document for references. It's one of the things that states request the most is those testing limits and all of that. So there are references in the back of every focus standard on where the information came from. There's plenty of information as to how the standards are developed, but they're all focus standards were developed according to American National Standards Institute international guidelines for standard development organizations, using voluntary consensus procedures. So happy to answer more questions. I don't want us to get too much in the weeds about the testing requirements, as that's just a single section of this, but I did want to make sure that I took a second to answer those questions.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was gonna say there are a few questions. Would you like me to read them, or Leslie, would you like to read them?
I've been answering some
I think we were answering some. Yeah, I think that was the main reason to add the appendix was because we did have comments that, you're not telling us anything about. And so those are examples, but we wanted to make sure, when you do regulation, you do need to consider some things, so. And one of the things I think that's important is we did stress the documentation and the maintenance of records. And we did have comments a lot about, well, how long do you keep these records? And so we did add some timelines, but we also said, or within the regulatory framework of what's needed. So,
yeah,
we had double things where people were saying, tell us something, what's normal, and then, but we didn't want to overstep and say it has to always be 2 years or whatever. You can decide, but somebody needs to decide how long the industry needs to keep the records within the state. So
yeah, so we decided a minimum of 2 years and figured a state can use that as a guide to determine what their minimum is.
yeah, that was a big one that we had, and we had because we did have a lot of record retention and keeping documents, and then also making sure that we don't say things have to be done, which don't make sense, and are not doable. That was 2 other things that were.
Yeah, there was a lot of that because, and this kind of goes back to the earlier question about why not use more GMP type stuff and whatever, but expecting regulators to review every SOP and know what they mean and that they're effective and do what they're supposed to do is not realistic either. And so when writing this, we had to be cognizant of what the impact would be on the other end and what's realistic for a regulatory body to be able to manage and actually monitor. And we were trying to very much keep that in mind so that we weren't putting a document together that was excessive of that or putting anybody into a bad situation that, they couldn't monitor.
Yeah, I think that's addressed everything up till now, unless somebody else.
Yep.
Yeah.
And are there more questions?
No, that was.
I'm not seeing any other questions on here. Anybody have any questions? Taking it easy on us. Normally the Q&A part is my favorite part.
Yeah. And the document did just get posted today in case you think you missed an email. Something, so don't.
And I think we'll be sending out a follow-up email to participants too with the link. And I think we'll also include, links to the documents and standards and all that kind of stuff. So anybody that didn't get a chance to check it out, we'll definitely have that. And I think we've mentioned it a few times, but it bears repeating, we really want your feedback and input on this and participation. I think there was a gentleman, Brian, that had made a comment about the 21 CFR 128 reference for HACCP. And thank you, Brian, for that comment. That's very valuable. And it's part of the reason that we are taking the time to even do a webinar about this rather than just publishing this document, because we really did want to open it up and make sure that we gave everybody the chance to, to hear about it, but also to know that we really want your input. we want this to be a valuable document to everybody. And there's nobody on our team that thinks this is absolutely perfect the way it is today. That really wasn't our intent. It was just to do the best we could to get the guidance out that we can continue to build from and really move forward from just the basic USDA hemp regulations that end at harvest and have some guidance for post-harvest.
And things will change too. The Delta 8's a perfect example, that popped up and so, where did we say Delta 9 only? Do we have that in the document?
Yeah. And I guess maybe that is worth mentioning too. So you'll notice throughout the document, we use the definition of hemp provided by USDA and the Farm Bill. But when we talk about THC levels in this model code, we're talking about total THC levels. We did not specify Delta 9 due to the problems that we've seen within the states and the conflict between federal regulations with the legality of Delta 8 and all of that. So there's a lot of, cannabis is tricky. It's lots of different areas. So it's more than food or drugs or anything, right? There's lots of supplements. There's lots of areas, and this is definitely the step in the right direction to kind of address those. I want to just say this as a comment to any attendees that while definitions seem so boring and so just logistics and not that important, they truly are the crux of all of this. And a lot of the trouble that we have in cannabis today is because we don't have these standardized definitions that really matter. And I think you don't understand that too much until you dig into trying to create a document like this. But I mean, literally that is something that plagued us throughout. I mean, it wasn't just, oh, well, let's write some definitions at the beginning and move on. We would get through and write a chapter or a section and then have to go back and go, wait, does that work? And that doesn't go with this reference to the food code or this reference to OSHA or whatever. So there's a lot of work to still be done for sure. But we hope this is a great starting point and guide.
And one thing too, we didn't redo the entire food code in this document, or you'd be reading 300 pages. We had discussions. So it did get linked to sections of the food code, so that definitely more information, but in addition, the entire food code's there. So you don't have to just stop in that one little section. You can read before, after, from the beginning, that sort of thing. So, but we didn't want to just drag the entire food code over and go around the edges on it. So. And I guess, wait, there's one more question.
Says, how much of the new model code might be useful once federal legislation legalizing cannabis is passed? I'm happy to take a stab, but I feel like everybody should give their answer too.
That would have been a good Steve question.
It would have been a great Steve question, but I mean, in general, what we tried to do and the intent of this document is to align with federal guidelines and not just state. So the hope and intent is that most of this would still be applicable. And this is why we were using federal regulations and not just going state by state.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes sense, Leslie. That's pretty much.
It's a really hard thing from an industry perspective and an operator, which, my background, 10 years ago, to think about the fact that you're spending all of these time and resources getting ready and meeting state regulations that are not adequate for when federal legalization takes place. And that's exactly what's happened. We saw it happen with hemp. And I think on the marijuana side of the industry, there's some questions there too. And they remain on the hemp side because we haven't seen the FDA formal guidance on the manufacturing of hemp products. But certainly the intent of this document is to guide those discussions and show what needs to be considered and the importance of the items within this document. So I would be surprised if a lot of it is not in the end results. Because
I would say quite a bit of it. When we start to look at the model code and how it relates to the model food code, the industry is participating in creating different products and services or products to the consumer. So if I have a a food contact surface, there's not going to be much deviation. I still don't want E. coli and fecal coliform on that surface. We need to be, you know, the standards and the regulations already there as to what a total count should be in those specific pathogens and how to clean a surface. You know, we're dealing with a high, you know, if we're growing indoors, we have high water activity, making sure that we have the right building materials to be suitable for the production of those, you know, for hemp or cannabis is really important. So when we look at the model food code and how it's arranged with 21 CFR, the model food code and other different provisions, I think quite a bit of this model food code is applicable from a, if you were to look at a federal legalization or the ability to, you know, cross state lines in the cannabis industry as a whole, whether it's hemp or cannabis by their legal definition.
Yeah, good point. Any other questions? If not, I think we're probably good. We really didn't want to get on here and read the document to you. It was more just to kind of introduce it, explain some of the challenges, make sure everybody knew where to find it and get involved if they want to. And I'm sure there'll be more to all of this, but Kyle, Yvonne, you have anything else you want to add?
No, just Leslie is a co-chair for the AFDO Cannabis Committee. So, you know, that's just a great starting point. And if you do have questions, please feel free to email any of us. You know, we'll get it answered if it's not something we can answer. And I think, you know, just look at AFDO as a resource for some of these questions that you have with this product.
For sure. Yeah. And we want your feedback too. So even if it's just an email with some comments on this, we'll likely set up an email address just to take comments on this and get that out in the follow-up as well. So, but you know, our goal is to continue to update and improve this. So we need you guys and your help to do it. And we appreciate you taking the time to listen.
And special thanks to all the helpers with the document. There was quite a group and all the reviews as well.
Absolutely. And just to echo what you guys just said, get involved, man. We're an emerging market, and it's an opportunity to help form and shape this industry to be healthier and safer, more efficient. There's a lot of benefits to getting involved, and it's a great opportunity to do so.
And one other thing is, you know, AFDO does have a meeting coming up in the summertime, and the Cannabis Committee also will have a meeting at that slot. It'll be virtual, so you know a lot of people can plan to attend. So please.
Yeah, it's in June. It's on the AFDO website, and there'll be a specific cannabis track with a few different live sessions, some with regulators, some with operators. We're doing some video tours. Oh, thank you. Amy just put the link into the chat box. But that's a great way to kind of have a look and meet the Cannabis Committee and see some of the work we do. And, you know, before getting involved, if you just want to check it out, love to have you. And I'm always available to answer any questions about any of that too. More than happy to.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy.
All right. I
Good,
think
Dan.
we're good. And
Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for attending. And we're looking forward to seeing it online.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Okay.